Atoms interact with each other in a number of ways. One way is through the formation of bonds. Atoms form bonds in order to achieve stable electron arrangements and to get electrons to neutralize the positive charge of the protons in the nucleus. The outermost shell of an atom is called the valence shell. The electrons in the valence shell are ones that are available to interact with other atoms to form bonds. Electrons in the inner shell are protected and not available for bonding, although they do contribute to the overall charge of the atom. A full electron shell is more stable than one that is only partially full. So to achieve more stable electron arrangements, atoms tend to lose or gain electrons from their valence shell in order to end up with a full outer shell. The noble gases in the rightmost column of the periodic table all have full valence shells. Argon at the end of the third row has 8 electrons in its outer shell. This is a very stable arrangement and is why noble gases are chemically inert. Atoms with nearly full valence shells tend to pick up electrons to fill that shell and achieve noble gas electron arrangements. Atoms with valence shells that are almost empty tend to lose electrons in order to empty the outer shell, making the lower, already full shell the outer shell. The way atoms either gain electrons to fill the outer shell or lose electrons to empty the outer shell drives chemical interactions between atoms. Atoms that completely capture or completely lose electrons in order to achieve full outer orbitals gain a charge, becoming ions. Hydrogen, for example, with its single electron in the first s orbital, can lose an electron and become a positively charged hydrogen ion. By losing or gaining electrons, ions are able to stabilize their electron configuration, but at the cost of gaining a charge. Positive and negative charges attract each other. This attraction is the basis for the formation of ionic bonds. Ionic bonds form from the electrostatic attraction, that is, the attraction between protons in the nucleus of one atom and electrons from other atoms. Gaining a charge gives the ions stable electron configurations, and combining with other ions through ionic bonds helps neutralize that charge. This creates very energetically favorable conditions for the atoms involved. Ion formation is not the only way atoms can achieve a full outer electron shell. Take hydrogen again. Rather than losing an electron and becoming an ion, 2 hydrogen atoms can combine to form H2 gas. In this configuration, the pair of atoms share 2 electrons, resulting in a full valence shell for each of them. These are called covalent bonds. Covalent bonds involve atoms sharing pairs of electrons. They form between many different types of atoms, including atoms of the same element, like these 2 hydrogen atoms. Another example is the molecular oxygen that we breathe. It is diatomic oxygen, that is 2 oxygen atoms covalently bound to each other. In order to fill their outer shells, the oxygen atoms share not 1, but 2 pairs of electrons, making these double bonds. Atoms can also form triple bonds, which is the sharing of 3 pairs of electrons. The more pairs of electrons atoms share, the stronger the bond, that is, the more energy it takes to break. Covalent bonds form when the energy present in the newly formed molecule is lower than the energy present in each of the atoms alone. Therefore, energy is released when these bonds form. The energy comes from the stability the atoms gain by filling their valence shells. The exact positioning of the bonded atoms is due to a balance between the electrostatic attraction of the electrons from each atom for the nucleus of the other atom that pulls them together, and the protons of each atom pushing away from each other. That it is energetically stable means that it takes energy to push the atoms closer together and energy to pull them further apart. Energy is conserved in this process. The amount of energy required to break a covalent bond is equal to the amount released when it is formed. The strongest covalent bonds occur between atoms with similar electrostatic attraction for electrons, including between atoms with identical electrostatic charges like these 2 hydrogen atoms. Contrast this with ionic bonds, which form between atoms with opposite electrostatic charges. When the atoms in a covalent bond have similar electrostatic charge, they share the electrons evenly. These are called non-polar covalent bonds. Covalent bonds can also occur between atoms with different electrostatic charges, and in these cases, the electrons are not shared evenly. A good example of this is carbon dioxide, which forms when 2 oxygen atoms covalently bond with a carbon atom. These are double bonds, so each oxygen shares 2 electrons with the carbon. This gives the oxygens the 2 electrons needed to fill their valence shells. The 2 double bonds also give the carbon the 4 additional electrons needed to fill its outer shell. Oxygen is more electrostatically negative than carbon, so the shared electrons are drawn more strongly towards the oxygen. This difference in electrostatic charge between the oxygens and the carbon cause the shared electrons to be pulled more strongly towards the oxygen atoms and away from the carbon atom. To distinguish these bonds from bonds with more equal sharing of electrons, bonds where the electrons are pulled more strongly towards one or other of the atoms in the pair are called polar covalent bonds. Another example of a polar covalent bonds are the ones in water molecules, which is formed when two hydrogens covalently bond with an oxygen atom. These are single covalent bonds, so each hydrogen is sharing an electron with the oxygen. This gives all three atoms full valence shells. Oxygen is again more electrostatically negative, so the electrons are not shared evenly. For reasons having to do with the shape of the oxygen's p orbitals, this molecule is not symmetric. The combination of the presence of polar covalent bonds and the asymmetry of the molecule make water an example of a special case in which the unequal sharing of the electrons cause the entire molecule to be polar, which means there is a difference in charge from one side of the molecule to the other. Keep in mind the total number of electrons and protons in the molecule are equal, so overall the molecule has no charge, but the position of the oxygen relative to the two hydrogens creates a difference in charge across the molecule. These partial charges are called dipoles. A special notation is used to distinguish these partial charges from the full positive and negative charges found in ions. A plus sign is written at the positive dipole, and then a line from the plus sign is extended as an arrow pointing to the negative dipole. Lowercase deltas followed by the sign of the partial charge in that region can also be drawn by the atoms with these partial charges. The difference in charge across polar molecules such as water creates the conditions for another type of bond, which is called the hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds form due to attraction between negative and positive dipoles of polar molecules. For water, this means the more electrostatically negative oxygen atoms line up with the neighboring molecules such that they are oriented towards the hydrogen side of the molecule. This structured arrangement and the presence of weak hydrogen bonding between the molecules is what gives water many of its important properties, including a strong surface tension, the ability to dissolve many substances, and high specific heat. The final bond type is the metallic bond. These bonds are unusual in that they do not form between pairs of atoms. Metallic bonds require the involvement of many atoms. They can be formed by atoms with d orbitals because the d orbital electrons are not as tightly associated with the atom as s and p orbital electrons. The relatively loosely associated electrons are able to move between the atoms, essentially allowing all of the atoms to share the electrons. This is sometimes called the electron sea model, with a group of metal nuclei sitting in a sea of shared electrons. These free-flowing electrons give metals some of their distinct characteristics, including high conductivity and malleability. All of these bonds form because they place the atoms involved into energetically favorable states. Energy is released when they are formed, and energy is required in order to break these bonds.